So welcome to this research seminar hosted by NTU English. My name is Michelle Wong, and I'm an associate professor of English at the School of Humanities at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. So today I'm delighted to be hosting this talk with Professor Angus Fletcher, who is a professor in the Department of English at The Ohio State University. So Professor Fletcher studied neuroscience as an undergraduate at the University of Michigan before going on to do his PhD in literature at Yale University. He's a story scientist at OSU's Project Narrative, which is a world-renowned initiative that promotes state-of-the-art research and teaching of narrative studies. So I'll also take this chance to say a little bit about the important work that Project Narrative does, where Professor Fletcher is a member of the core faculty. And I'll quote from their mission statement here. So the project focuses on narrative in all of its guises, from everyday storytelling in face-to-face interaction to oral history and autobiography, to films, graphic novels, narratives associated with digital environments, to, of course, the complex narratives found in modern and postmodern fiction and poetry and more. So Project Narrative highlights the importance of developing an integrative, interdisciplinary approach to narrative, and faculty working under its auspices draw on multiple traditions of research, including rhetorical and literary theory, ethics, cognitive science, and more. Which of course brings us to our speaker today, Professor Fletcher, who started his journey not as a literary theorist, but as a neuroscientist. And for the moment, we'll save questions that we have about your fascinating trajectory from a neuroscientist to a story scientist for the Q&A. But briefly, just to quote from his webpage here, Professor Fletcher pioneered the integration of modern neuroscience with rhetorical narrative theory, which he succinctly explains, draws on scientific research to unearth the psychological effects of story. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences, and more. And his scholarship is amazingly wide-ranging, which is one of its distinctive qualities. And among his recent publications is the book that he'll be talking about today. The title of the book is Wonderworks. And for our NTU students, this is available in our library, and I highly recommend it to all of you. And just looking at, I suppose, the cover page of the paperback gives us a vivid sense of the profound scope that the scholarship encompasses. So from Austen, Bechdel to Cao Xueqin to Sappho, Socrates, and Shakespeare, his research, and I'm quoting your OSU faculty profile page here, emphasizes neurodiversity, cultural difference, evolutionary variety, narrative flexibility, the infiniteness of stories, behavioral adaptability, practical problem solving, personal growth, democratic pluralism, and the biological benefits of curiosity, inclusion, and tolerance. And I will also mention here that along with my colleagues Neil Murphy and Cheryl Julia Lee, we were delighted to be able to include Professor Fletcher's important work in the Routledge Companion to Literature and Art, published last year in 2024, where he discusses a new science of aesthetics, which is the title of the essay. And specifically in that essay, he's interested in what our brain's mechanisms can reveal about humankind's tendencies to make and to appreciate art. And he discusses wonder, beauty, the sublime as some of our responses to art and their profound implications for our lives as we live it. So I'm truly excited to welcome Professor Fletcher. So over to you, Angus.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that truly extraordinary introduction. I hope I don't totally disappoint. And I'm very thankful to you for navigating this enormous time zone difference between our two institutions. And I look forward to hopefully more conversations between our institutions in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by sharing my screen and launching a lecture in which I will talk about the hidden power of literature. And as you mentioned, my own background is in story science, which is kind of a bizarre new invention, partly of my own, but also drawing on a lot of other traditions. And sometimes when people hear story science, their minds are filled with brain scanners and running sort of strange experiments on undergraduates as they run through the quad, reading poetry. And we do all of that. But most of what we do is actually in this very boring building here, known as Project Narrative at Ohio State University, where we try and keep all of our most secret experiments under wraps so we don't get them shut down. What I'm going to do for you today is I'm going to explain to you a little bit about the method of story science, how you can use it yourself, how you can use your own inbuilt brain scanner known as your consciousness, just your awareness of what's going on in your head as you read your favorite works. But before I launch into anything too technical, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you just an example of what we do as story scientists. And so we start with a common experience that everybody has when they read a literary work. And so one of the most common experiences that we all have is the experience of love, by which I mean we develop a crush for the characters or possibly for the narrator. We feel this kind of like stirring amorous desire in ourselves as we feel this romantic attachment to something that isn't real, but is being stimulated somehow by this narrative that we're reading. And so the question, of course, is where does that come from? How does that happen? Because you can read some books and fall deeply, deeply in love with the characters, and you can read other books that seem to be exactly the same. You don't feel that at all. What's going on? What's the secret? What's the secret recipe for love? What we do as a story scientist is we start because one of our bases is something known as natural history. So one of the things we like to do is we like to go back in history to the earliest example we can find of a literary work that creates this effect in the brain. And we try and analyze that work as closely as we can, thinking of it as kind of a work where this new technology is starting to come into being, starting to be invented. So we can kind of get the simplicity of the invention without necessarily it being sort of clouded by all these other kind of formal techniques that are being used. So if you go back in history to the first work that creates love, or the first work we know anyway that creates love, it's written by Sappho. She's a poet writing in the Mediterranean a little over 2,000 years ago. And this is the poem. This is the first recorded poem that we have that creates love. So I'll read it for you quickly. Don't expect to fall in love because I'm not a great leader. But if you read it by yourselves quietly, I hope you will have some romantic effect. He seems to me a god, that man, listening to you chat sweetly and laugh like music, scattering my heart. When I look at you, I can't speak. My tongue breaks and my skin is on fire. So you can probably feel that last stanza is really where it starts to kick in. That's where something interesting occurs. And what happens here is this is the first time we know in literature where a voice makes a dangerous disclosure. A dangerous disclosure is revealing something true about yourself, a secret truth about yourself that could get you in a lot of trouble. And so the first thing that's dangerous about this is just that this character, this voice, this poet is confessing that she loves somebody in public. And that's always dangerous when you reveal your crush in public, right? We've all done that, and that can have very shameful, embarrassing consequences. Then on top of that, what's even more dangerous about this is that she's revealing that she loves someone who's already in a relationship. That's really dangerous, right? Because that person, who knows what might happen? They might tell their partner, all sorts of things might occur. That person might be very happy in their relationship. They might not want you to be telling them these things. And then, of course, the final thing that's dangerous about this is that this is a woman telling another woman who's in a relationship with a man that she loves her. So you can see all the kind of levels of danger. And this is a totally new thing in literature. Up to this point in literature, most of what we have is very powerful characters like gods and heroes declaring things about their awesomeness and not talking about their vulnerability. So the first thing we can say is that what Sappho does is she invents this technique of dangerous disclosure. Why is that important? Why is that so significant? Well, it's significant because when we make a dangerous disclosure, our brain, the listening brain, the person who hears this disclosure, has a choice. So when someone makes a dangerous disclosure to us, the first thing we can do is we can judge it. So if you've ever been in a scenario where someone has told you something personal or private, something vulnerable, you might have been a mean person, and you might have thought, well, that's weak, or that's lame. You might have judged them. And a lot of us, we've done this in our lives, and that's a cruel thing to do, but it's a human thing that you can do. So that's the first thing that can happen when somebody makes a dangerous disclosure. But the magic starts with the other thing that your brain can do. And the other thing your brain can do when it hears a dangerous disclosure is make a disclosure of its own. And we've also all had that experience where somebody reveals something vulnerable to us, and it makes us want to disclose back. And when that cycle of mutual disclosure occurs, you have love. Now, that love can be romantic, but it can also be friend. It can be a friendly romance. It can be a friendly attraction. But the key thing here is that you are developing this cycle of trust through mutual dangerous disclosure, through sharing things with the other person that you wouldn't share with other people. This has all sorts of kind of neurochemical responses. It releases all sorts of things, in your brain, all sorts of various chemicals. I won't de-romanticize it too much, but the point is that if you're going to have a real relationship with somebody else, you need to figure out how to be candid with them and tell things to them that are true, but that are dangerous, that you feel you don't want to disclose. And you also know that you're in a relationship with somebody that's not working when they're not sharing those things to you, when they're not revealing those things to you. And so what's remarkable about this poem is this poem teaches our brain about this cycle. This poem leads our brain through this cycle. So it's the first poem to do it, and it's, of course, imitated relentlessly. If you hear almost any song now that makes you swoon or feel a sense of attraction, you'll notice it follows this format of the singer, the lead character, the voice revealing something about themselves that is dangerous, perhaps, to reveal in other contexts. And one of the things that this leads to is the invention of the mode that we call the lyric mode. And the lyric mode is the mode in which I predominates. So it comes from the first person. And so you might think that what Sappho did here, she invented the lyric, and you might think that the lyric is the way to create love, and you always have to create love by using the lyric. But no, because what Sappho realized is that she could use this same invention in other forms of writing, including third-person forms of writing. And so I'm going to give you this example. So now this is an example of a poem that makes a disclosure in the third person. And this poem is this brilliant rewriting of the Iliad by Homer. If you've ever read the Iliad by Homer, you know it goes on and on and on. It's very long. It goes on for lines and books forever. And Sappho says, I'm going to rewrite the entire Iliad, and I'm going to rewrite it here. And instead, in this tiny short space, and instead of doing what the Iliad does, which is telling you this kind of story of war, I'm going to make you feel love. So I'll read this to you. And as I'm reading this to you, I want you to feel this attraction that you have towards the lead character, Helen. And I want you to see if you can identify the moment where there's a dangerous disclosure, where something is revealed. Some say that horsemen or soldiers or ships are the most beautiful things on earth. But I say it's your love. Isn't that why Helen, the most beautiful of women, left the best of men and sailed to Troy, forgetting her child and her mother, because in a glance she felt love? So what this poem does is this poem makes us feel the sense of attraction to Helen that started the Trojan War. This poem is basically saying, this is really how the war started, not out of violence, because of that feeling. So what's the moment of disclosure? What's the dangerous thing that's being revealed? What's the moment here where we get close to the secrets of Helen's heart? The moment is this: forgetting her child. Why is that a dangerous disclosure? Well, first of all, in the Greek world, if you're a mother, your entire purpose is your children. If you go and read Homer's Iliad, it's all about how Helen feels this responsibility to her children and so on and so forth. But what Helen is confessing here is a feeling that many adults have had when they fall in love, which is that they forget the other most important things in their lives. And is it possible that there might be a mother out there who falls so suddenly in love that she forgets her own child, even just for a second? Of course it is. Of course it is. That's the kind of dangerous moment, but that's also the moment that we know how powerful this love is, and that this love is real. And what's extraordinary about this, beyond this specific example, is that what Sappho is showing us is that you can use this technique, not just in lyric poems, but you can use it, for example, in films. In films, if you show a close-up of a character's face, and even without saying anything, there's an intimacy in their eyes where they reveal some vulnerability about themselves. That causes you to fall in love with that character. That's why when you watch Twilight, you're always falling in love with the characters because of all those incredible close-ups. So this is a technique which kind of can move across and do all these kinds of interesting things, invented by Sappho. Now, when we do story science, we not only pull techniques out, but we use them, because the way to really learn how to use a technique to kind of understand its operations is to try it yourself. So in classes, I will always ask my students, if you like Sappho, we're going to write a love poem, and I'm going to challenge you to make a dangerous disclosure in that love poem. So you see how it works, you see how it's hard to write, but you also see the effect. And even if you don't want to write a poem, you can do like Sappho. All you have to do is you have to say, think of someone in your family who you love, Think of a true secret that you're scared to disclose to them. What's something that you're scared to share with that person? Then write that secret down. You can write it as a poem if you want, but you can just write it down on a piece of paper otherwise. And then the next time that that person takes a chance and reveals something to you, don't judge them. Instead, reveal to them what you've written down on that piece of paper. And the moment you do that, you'll feel your bond grow, you'll feel your intimacy grow, and you'll have created a poem between yourselves. So that's the kind of the big method there, just an example of story science. We go into a work, we uncover what's special about it, we see how it works on our mind, and then we take that knowledge and we use it to act in our own lives so that literature becomes a source of wisdom and action in our real lives. And we're always going back to literature to learn more about our brains and how our brains work and how we can get more out of our brains. But then we're not confining that to literature. We're using that, as the ancients did, to live lives that are more like the lives that we want to live. And the reason this is broadly important is because it gets us something that we've forgotten in modern schools. You know, my kids are in school now, and pretty much they just read for comprehension. So they're given all these books. They're just told to skim them basically for information. And then once they've got the information, they fill in these kinds of, multiple choice. And you know what? It turns out that AI can do that. Robots can do that. It doesn't actually involve that much intelligence. And then people start to say, well, if robots can do this, why are we reading literature at all? What's the point of books? And the answer is, as everyone knows, because books aren't about information. Books are about nurturing our emotional development. And they're about sparking our imagination. They're about helping us develop this fullness that we have as humans so that we can use all these different parts of our brain that computers don't have. And that's the value of reading. And that's the value of story science, is that story science allows us to start to understand how literature can do all of these things. And for a long time, before the last 20 years, people just took it for granted that literature would do these things, which is why we read literature in school. But nobody explained the science of it. And because nobody explained the science of it, we now think, well, literature doesn't do those things because there's no science establishing it. And so literature has been thrown out, even though literature is really the thing that drives, for example, innovation. Steve Jobs said that it was reading Shakespeare that prompted him to imagine the iPhone and the Apple computer and all those kinds of things. And it's literature which helps us develop a sense of life purpose. I mean, how many people have lost their way and then found a book and opened that book and rediscovered what it was they were doing with their lives? And it's literature which helps us think like scientists. This isn't something we talk about very much now. But if you go back to the 19th century when detective fiction is invented, it's no coincidence that at the moment the detective fiction is invented, all of a sudden everyone in England becomes an amateur scientist and science takes off because detective fiction is teaching you how to think like a scientist. So all these incredible things, but because we haven't done the work of explaining how it works in the brain, no one in the modern world understands it. And so literature is being shunted to the side. And so what we want to do in story science is say, no, stop. Here's how it works. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you one more example of how this works, and then I'm going to give you a kind of broader method so that you can keep doing this for yourself for the rest of your life. So one of the other things that we go to for literature for is healing. It's helping us process things like burnout, grief, and shame. And in my own research, I was brought a text, Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, which I'd never read before. And I was brought this text by a lot of people who had been suffering from post-traumatic stress and who had read this book, and it helped them, and they had felt that it had helped them process part of their emotional experience. And they came to me and they said, Angus, why is this book having this effect? Why is it helping me to heal? And I was totally fascinated. So I read the book, and we got to work in my lab, and we came up with an answer. So I'm going to give you that answer. But to give you that answer, first I have to step back a little bit and talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about post-traumatic stress, because there are, in fact, two kinds of post-traumatic stress, and they are often conflated. And by teasing them apart, we can understand more about the mechanics of post-traumatic stress in the brain, and we can also understand how literature can help both of those kinds. So type 1 is the one that we're usually most familiar with. It's the kind that's typically associated with soldiers. It often results from a single, sharp, violent trauma. And the way that it works in the brain is that at the center of our brain, we have this ancient hub of emotion, which is really primal and which registers things like fear and joy. And then at the front of our brain, we have what you can think of is a brake, like the brake on your car, which tamps down on that primal part of the brain. So when you feel fear, your brain goes, oh my goodness, I'm scared. And then the front of your brain tamps down and you say, okay, I feel fear, but I can act. So you've got those two parts, the emotion producer and the brake in the prefrontal cortex. What happens in type 1 PTSD is that brake stops functioning. And so that emotion just gets stronger and stronger and stronger and more unpredictable. And you have flashbacks and uncontrollable fear and all these kinds of things. Well, now let's go to type 2, because type 2 is more common in survivors of domestic abuse and survivors of sexual violence and things like that. And type 2 presents very differently. It presents instead not as uncontrollable emotion, but as numbness, or more technically, dissociation, or depersonalization, derealization. These are if you feel like life is unreal, like a dream, or if you feel like you somehow are unreal, and what's happening to you isn't really happening to you, and you're just kind of like drifting through things. This occurs in the brain through the opposite mechanism of type 1. So remember, in type 1, the brake stopped functioning, and so the emotion was too strong. In type 2, the brain locks on because it perceives emotion as being so dangerous, because when you're in a state of chronic abuse, you're scared all the time, you're anxious all the time, you're feeling pain all the time. And so your brain says, you know, it's too dangerous to feel emotion. And so the brake locks on, you stop feeling emotions, you're not scared anymore, you can function, but you also stop feeling joy and happiness and anything else. So you just kind of drift through life in this numb state. So now you understand the kind of brain mechanics behind these. Let's talk a little bit about literature and what literature can do to help us process these. It's been known for thousands of years that type 1 can be helped by dramatic tragedy. So classic tragedies like Aeschylus and Sophocles. And what that does is that kind of walks you through this process of experiencing these negative emotions in limited amounts, which allows your brain to start to re-engage its brake and start to learn how to kind of process them and walk through them. And so that's a well-covered area of research that predates my own research, predates my experience with Fun Home. You can read a lot about that if you're interested. Research on that goes back about 30 years now. But then there's a question of type 2. What's going on there? Well, what scientists have recently discovered is that the way to get out of type 2 is if you can surprise the brain into positive emotion. Because if you can surprise the brain into positive emotion, what happens then is that positive emotion escapes the brake and floods the brain. And the brain all of a sudden remembers, oh my goodness, emotion can be good. And the more you have those surprises of positive emotion, the more gradually the dissociation, the depersonalization, the derealization starts to ease, you start to become reconnected with your life, and you start to be able to feel those emotions normally in your life. You start to be able to feel connections with the people you love. This was discovered also by the ancients, a playwright called Euripides, who invented something called tragicomedy. Tragicomedies end with surprising and unexpected good endings, where you're watching a tragedy, you're like, oh my goodness, everyone's going to die. And then a god arrives, and it's like, no, we're all saved. Let's have a feast and a festival. And that's that moment. And even more effective than that, at least from a modern reader, is Alison Bechdel. Because, unfortunately, I'm going to ruin the ending for you. The ending of Fun Home involves a surprise twist into gratitude, into joy. And when readers hit that page, bang, it lifts them out of dissociation, it reconnects them with positive emotion, and they're able to carry that positive emotion with them through the rest of their lives. So once again, now that we've understood that mechanism, what we like to do is we like to kind of put it into practice in our actual lives. And so we've done this a lot, for example, with U.S. Army Nursing Corps. We encourage them to go through their own memories when they had a positive surprise. And you can do this yourself. If you're feeling grief, see if you can remember a time when the world has surprised you positively. If you're feeling burnout, can you remember a time when another person has surprised you positively? If you're feeling shame, can you feel a time when you have surprised yourself positively? If you do this, if you think about this, these have very powerful clinical effects. And one of the things you can do is if you write down those memories, effectively creating your own memoir, doing just like Alison Bechdel did when she rediscovered this gratitude in her own life. If you write that down as a memoir, that will have permanent, deep healing effects on your brain for all of these conditions. Okay, so that's another example of how story science works, how we go into a literary work, how we identify how it works in the brain, and then how we take that knowledge and use it ourselves to live literary lives, to practice the art of writing memoirs or writing love poems in our actual lives. So we don't just keep the book on a shelf, but we take it out with us into the world. And there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these other neural benefits I could go through. For example, courage. Courage is created by something we know as the omniscient sentimental narrator. This is the beginning of Homer. This is the beginning of Charles Dickens. If you want to have this effect, you can sing to yourself in the shower, because what an omniscient sentimental narrator does, it makes you feel like you're a bigger human. And when you sing to yourself in the shower, your voice is amplified, so you feel like you're a bigger human. But I won't go through all of those. I won't go through all of those examples now. I just want to let you know that they're there if you're interested, so you can explore them. Instead, what I want to do is I just want to give you the method so you can do this yourself. And so the method, which is laid out in my book, Wonderworks, the method is really simple. Start by picking a work that you love, that has a strong effect on you, and then think, what's unique about the effect that that work has on your brain? Don't worry if there's other works that have that effect on other people's brains. That's not what's important. What's important is that you develop your sense of what unique effect it's having on your brain. And you can think about this in the way, for example, you think about taste in terms of food. When you're eating a piece of food and you start to think like, what's specific and unique about this food? Why do I like this food? I like, if you like chocolates, why do you like one chocolate more than another chocolate? Start to think to yourself as specifically as you can, what's unique about this particular sweetness? Or what's unique about this particular flavor of romance in this book? So the more specific you can be about that, the better. And once you've got that sense of what is unique about the work, trace it back to something that is unique and original about the writer's use of character, plot, story world, or narrator. Those are the kind of 4 building blocks of story. And this is what we do with all story sciences. We identify these unique effects and we trace them back to these unique narrative elements. The most important thing here is the emphasis on the word unique. For a long time, when people talked about stories, they like to analyze them into archetypes and these kinds of universal things. And what we know about stories is that they're incredibly flexible. They existed in the human brain. They exist in the human brain to allow us to make plans and plots to survive with changing and unpredicted times. That's why narratives are really there. That's why every culture has different stories from every other culture. That's why every individual has different stories. The way that you tell stories is going to be slightly different from everyone in your family. And that's why writers can constantly invent new things. And so what we're really interested in as story scientists is the same thing that biologists are interested in when they go into the Amazon rainforest. The biologist isn't like, where's the archetypal bug? Where's the universal tree? They're like, what's a new tree? What's a new beetle? What's something new I can learn from nature? And that's how we think as story scientists. And although we do have this structure in terms of focusing on things like character and plot, we only use that as a way of helping us surface these techniques and surface these innovations. If you're trying to kind of like figure out what the value of those psychological effects are, broadly, we think about them as having kind of 2 major effects. The first is mental health, and mental health is kind of taking you from a negative place. So we talked earlier about grief and burnout. Literature can take you from that and restore you to a state of neutral health. And so that's lifting you up from negative to neutral. But then we also think about literature's creating mental flourishing. And flourishing is about going beyond the neutral into these other states, like, for example, love or curiosity or wonder or any of the other many, many kind of important effects that literature can have. And so this framework might also be helpful for you in terms of thinking about when you're thinking about your favorite works, what are they doing exactly? Are they lifting me from a negative place or are they giving me something positive? And the more specific you can be about it, the more likely you are to be able to understand what the unique invention is. When you go through story science, it can help you with all of these things. It can help you figure out how to encourage empathy in others, help you figure out how to boost innovation, excite your imagination, enhance your life meaning, all these kinds of things. We use it to build leaders in the United States Army. So there's all these wonderful things that you can take from literature. But really the most important thing is for you to start by focusing on your library, the books that you like, and what they're doing for you. And once you've got that together, find a friend, see what books they have that you don't understand immediately that are challenging for you, and then learn how to use those books. And so it's that process of starting from where you are and mastering what your brain already knows about literature, and then stretching and growing by going into books that are a little more challenging, a little more difficult, like when you go to the library and, you ask for one book that you're going to like, and then you ask for one book that might be a little bit of a challenge. Because when you put those two parts together, you both support your brain where it is, and you also push it always to develop and grow and find those deeper potentials in itself to be healthier and happier and to spread that to others as well. So that's my talk on the hidden power of literature. Hopefully that was mostly engaging. And Michelle, if you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them, and then we can roll on to my next talk.
Thanks so much, Angus. That was a fascinating talk. And I think there's just so much of that resonates not only as a scholar, but also as a teacher, right? Because so often, a student would come to me and say, I'm stuck on my argument and what I want to say about the text. And I'll ask, well, what do you want to say about the text? And it's almost as though, in part, their training, of course, partly enabled by us as teachers, kind of needs them to skip over this bit in which they say, what drew me about the text? And for me, that's always a fundamental question in terms of, if you're stuck, go back to, why this book? I mean, I assigned so many texts on a syllabus, so why this particular text? So it's great that you're sharing that method with us, I suppose. So I found that fascinating. Thanks so much. And that's a really kind of dangerous and tantalizing experiment, the do like Sappho. I'm just wondering if students have ever come back to you to tell you what happened when they did that, because I'm fascinated by what, it's very unpredictable, which I think is what makes it so interesting. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the first thing, I mean, of course, the reason it can be dangerous is you are making a dangerous disclosure, obviously. And that's why what we say in the experiment is wait for that other person to make a disclosure first. And then what's happening there is you're kind of learning how it works in a safe environment. Don't go out and make your dangerous disclosure to somebody you don't know, or don't go out and make that dangerous disclosure, to somebody who could put you in a vulnerable position. But, once you're in that safe relationship with somebody who you trust, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a sibling, maybe it's a close friend, and they make that disclosure, go ahead and make one yourself and start to feel how that builds that relationship, builds that romance. And what that does is that allows you to kind of take intentional control of your own feelings, because, all of us have had crushes that didn't work out so well for us, and then all of us have been in situations where we probably should be more vulnerable, and where we should probably, nurture that relationship and kind of get over some of our fears and get over some of our tendency to shut down emotionally. And so the main purpose there is just to kind of help you learn that. And poetry for generations was the way that people learned about their hearts, and was the way they learned how to use them. And we're not really reading poetry that way anymore. I mean, to kind of go back to what you're saying about the important thing about literature, is that we just discover in our classes, very few people read anymore. There's just very little reading. And there's just a lot of watching video or kind of like flicking through stuff on screens. And, it's not like video is evil or screens are evil, but if that's all you're doing, you're using about 2% of your brain, and you're not using and learning the rest of it. And so that's why I usually start with love, because love is something that most students think is really important. And so once they kind of learn, oh, literature can help me with this, and then we start talking about grief, and most students are like, you know what, there is a lot of grief that I have in my life that I haven't figured out how to deal with. Then we say, okay, well, you've got to read these longer books. There are these longer books that help you process grief. And in fact, Hamlet helps you process grief. And I know the first time you read Hamlet, it doesn't seem like that at all. It seems very boring. But then once you start to learn how to use Hamlet, it's incredibly powerful at helping you with that. And so it's that process of helping students understand that this literature isn't there being forced on them to socialize them or kind of indoctrinate them into kind of like, Western values or something like that. I mean, it could be used to do that potentially, right? I mean, if you had that kind of an institution, but it's there to help them process things that school isn't helping them process with, and most of them don't know how to process. And in fact, most of them get unhealthy advice on the internet, I would say, about processing. So that's a kind of big answer to that. And I agree with you that some of this stuff is a little bit risky, but of course, life is a little bit risky. And the idea of a classroom is to take safer risks, and to realize that particularly when it comes to life, literature is a space where you can kind of, in a more controlled environment, whether it's love, whether it's grief, whether it's anything like that, start to kind of explore your potential.
Thanks so much, Angus. And I think part of the sort of one of the most fascinating aspects of your work is your ability to integrate insights from neuroscience with the workings of rhetorical narrative theory, especially given sort of your interest in audiences. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about sort of I really appreciated you taking us through the way in which the brain's sort of emotional break works in the two different types of PTSD. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about, just to return to this bit with Sappho, about perhaps what are some of the brain mechanisms that underlie our need for reciprocity. So because that's part of it, right? That you're talking about an important way in which this works is when the voice makes a sort of dangerous disclosure. First, we assess, of course, whether, is this real? Are you stringing me along? Are you playing me? That skepticism comes into play. But once that's sort of alleviated, what drives our need for reciprocity, particularly since it seems so counterintuitive, right? Because revealing vulnerability is bad for survival, I suppose, in some ways. But you're also saying, let's look at what's important about this revelation, because it helps us build these connections and relationships of trust. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the brain mechanisms that underlie these kinds of responses.
Yeah, because vulnerability does seem dangerous from a survival perspective. Like, why would the human brain ever have evolved vulnerability? Shouldn't we have just evolved anger and rage? Shouldn't we always just be attacking everyone all the time? Well, the paradox of life is that the greatest advantage comes from social connections. So actually, as an individual, you need society. I mean, that's the paradox. And the question is like, how do you build a society which supports you as an individual? And that's very challenging because, as we all know, humans are very good at building societies that damage and destroy the individuals within them. But our brain has come up with this wonderful mechanism for building these small societies, which is that bonding mechanism. And we see this, for example, in mothers. So when infants are born, not every mother, but many mothers will have the experience of strong bonding with that infant. And that comes from this chemical reaction. Oxytocin is released, and that creates that bond. It's the same thing in a romantic relationship, is you're going to get that oxytocin release. It's the same thing with reading a poem. You're going to get that oxytocin release. And so really what that chemical is doing is that's overriding your sense of self-preservation. And there's this kind of remarkable thing that humans have this capacity to do, known as tend and befriend. So tend and befriend is the sort of it's sort of complementary and a little bit in tension with fight or flight. So all animals have this thing called fight or flight, and when they experience a threat, they go to this fight or flight, which is basically run away or get very aggressive. And humans, when we experience a threat, have the ability to come closer together. So if you've ever been in a dangerous experience and there have been other people around you, a lot of times you feel close to them. That's known as tend and befriend. And that's because the human brain is releasing oxytocin in those moments. And so really what's happening here on a kind of biological level is the love poem is making us aware of the fact that there is actually something more important than ourselves. That to really survive, we need someone else. And this is true biologically because how do you survive biologically? Kids. And how do you have kids? Love. So ultimately what the poem is helping you connect with here is the sense that real immortality comes from being vulnerable, finding that partner that you can kind of create life with. And, in our modern world, even if we're not literally having children, the same thing holds, because by having that romantic relationship, we build that stronger bond, which supports and sustains us and also allows us to kind of sustain the lives around us. So there's a kind of truth, I think, beyond the biological in the cultural in that.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'll just, I guess, ask one last question before I let you talk about the second half of your lecture. So I was thinking in particular about the point that you were making on how, I guess, the sort of locked on break can sort of be eased, which is to surprise the brain with positive emotion. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about this matter of surprise, right, as a kind of response that we have, because I was thinking here about its connection with this other thing that you talk about in Wonderworks, which is the plot twist. Right. So it seems that the sort of flooding with positive emotion is important, but it also seems that this point or this mechanism or whatever we want to call it, this issue of surprise in itself, the unexpected, right, seems kind of really important. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
That's exactly right. And you've already articulated it probably better than I can. But the important thing here is that when you have a positive surprise, what that's essentially telling you is that your brain is expecting something negative. And so your brain is like braced for this negative thing to happen, and then something positive happens, and your brain gets startled and it's not expecting it. And that leaves it open to that positive experience. And so when you read a work like Fun Home, or you read one of Euripides' tragedies, especially if you were in the initial audience for one of those tragedies, you wouldn't know if it was going to end positively or not. And so the whole play is telling you it's going to go negative, 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 and you're braced for that. And then all of a sudden, the twist happens, the plot twist happens, your brain is surprised, that knocks it off its guard, leaves it vulnerable to feel something it wasn't expecting, it realizes it likes that feeling, and then it grows. And so much of the way that our brain grows in general in life is through surprises. Computers never experience surprises. Logic never experiences surprises, because that's the point, because it knows everything. But life is about being continually surprised, and it's that surprise that makes us realize there's more to know, and because there's more to know, there's room to learn and there's room to grow. And so that's why I always think of the plot twist as being the kind of fundamental feature of literature. And this goes into kind of all these interesting directions. For example, logically, good comes from good and bad comes from bad. But when you read a story in which good comes from bad, what that starts to say to your brain on a deeper level is life is full of surprises in general. And if my life is really bad right now, that doesn't mean it's always going to be bad. And that allows for these slimmers of optimism and hope. And so much the reason that we turn to literature is in moments of darkness, when life isn't working the way that we want it to. We go to literature, and literature says, look, I can't promise that the future is going to be good, but I can promise that there's hope. I can promise that in the past, good has come from bad, so it could happen now. And so I think that's why the plot twist is so important. And the emotion that you're talking about in terms of the plot twist is wonder, and wonder is the most basic of spiritual experiences, and that's the most basic of being lifted outside of ourselves, having a self-transcendent experience, and realizing that life can be beyond what we imagine at this moment, and that there can be a heaven, or at least a better place than the place we're in now.
Thank you. That's so helpful. And in particular, when you were talking about this point about how our brain grows through surprise. I mean, of course, we're kind of familiar with it through this thing with counterfactual thinking, which is something that you talk about in the book as well. But I'm just kind of thinking about it in our interactions with kids, right? So I'm thinking about when we sing with my niece, for instance. So if you change the words to a song that they're familiar with, they're delighted by it. They laugh so hard, and it's this thing where the brain growing through surprise. So just to ask you to say a little bit more about that. What's the science here, I suppose, for those of us who don't kind of have a very full grasp of neuroscience? Why is this issue of surprise so important to the way that our brain grows, in addition to, say, counterfactual thinking?
Yeah, well, the main thing here is that life is always changing. And the reason that humans have been successful is because we're open to change. And one of the weird things that happens over life is, as we get older, we become less and less open to change, and we become less and less open to surprises. And you'll notice this all the time with adults. When something really weird happens, they always have an explanation as to why it's not that weird or how they expected it to happen. We're living in a very weird moment right now in our world, where all sorts of strange things are happening. And if you talk to most adults, they have a very clear explanation as to exactly why it's happening. And those explanations are all wrong. And on the other hand, if you talk to a child, they'll be like, I have no idea what's happening right now, but I'm just so amazed, and I know that because I'm amazed, I want to look at this thing more. And that's really the value of the surprise, is it encourages our brain to pause, to dwell, to look at it. And as you say, to engage in this cycle that we call narrative science, causal thinking, and then counterfactual thinking, which we try to imagine, why did that happen? And what if I changed some element of that? What would go differently? And we kind of go through this kind of story thinking cycle. So, I mean, that's basically how it works in our brain. And I think that's why, basically, if you want to keep growing your entire life, you have to do what you did as a child and lean into that surprise response and suppress that adult tendency to think you always have the answers to things, because the reality is life is much bigger than any of us can imagine or know.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Angus.